Will India rise geopolitically? It has already taken over China in terms of demographics.
Well, let's start with the data there. India overtook China probably almost a decade ago. The Chinese have started to revise their data. They're admitting that they overcounted by over 100 million people. So India has been the world's largest country in terms of population for some time. However, that transition as you urbanize and have fewer children, that has hit India as well. And since India was kind of a latecomer, not starting its industrial process until the 80s, it happened there much more quickly than it did, say, in Europe. So I don't mean to suggest that India is facing a dark future. Not what I'm saying. But their demographic moment is now, not in the past. They have basically the pyramid starts with older people, comes down to people in their 50s and then their 40s. And when you hit the 30s in India, it then goes almost straight down. The birth rate halved back in the 90s, and it has not bounced back. Now, that means at this moment in time, India does kind of have the magic mix. Because if you've got a lot of young adults who are 20 to 40, but not a huge number of kids, the money that they would have spent on their kids, they spend on themselves. And you get a lot higher quality of growth, because when you're building homes and buying cars, that's going to just generate more follow-on growth than when you're buying diapers and taking care of childcare. So there's this 20-year period that the Indians have in front of them where they're going to have much more robust growth. But if their birth rate continues to drop, then 30 years from now, they're going to be looking at a situation like the Germans are facing today. Now, there's a lot that can go wrong and right in 30 years, but it is something to keep in mind. The youngest country in India's cohort is Mexico. They started the process a little bit later. The birth rate didn't drop quite as much, and the fact that they're partnered with the United States really helps. But when you want to talk about shining India, the idea of India as a major global power, you got to remember this. India has no partners at all. So Mexico can partner with the United States. Indonesia can partner with Vietnam and Singapore and Taiwan and Japan. India is on its own. Just the cultural norms of the country make it very difficult for it to see anyone else as an ally or even as a friend. And so any sort of manufacturing boom in India, which will happen, will have to be based entirely on Indian factors. And that's going to challenge the cost and the quality and everything else that goes along with that. So do I think India's got a great half century ahead of it? Yes, but by itself, not as part of a network that can help it.
India is going to bet on India, so to say. But let's focus on probably two stories that are most striking. And these are the stories of China and the story of Europe. Maybe let's begin first with China, because you don't have a lot of good news considering China's geopolitical positioning in this transitionary period of the international relations.
I think the biggest surprise that's going to be happening to most this decade is the collapse of China as a functional nation state. Their demographics are beyond terminal, and that was before they admitted that they miscounted by 100 million, and all the 100 million would have been people under age 40. So there's no point that they can support their existing population. There's no way that they can repopulate anymore. Their financial system is expanded by a factor of 34 since the year 2000, but their economy is barely quadrupled. So that's the biggest debt build we have seen in any country in human history. And now their payback for the new debt is minimal. So we've seen growth basically collapse from the 9 and 10% to like the 1 to 3%. And that's assuming you buy Chinese statistics, which I do not. They are completely dependent on the import of raw materials to support their agricultural and their energy system. And with the Ukraine war, they are now getting crude that is going west out of Russia to the Baltic, goes around Europe, goes through Suez, goes by India, goes by Vietnam, goes by Taiwan on the way in. So it's the most insecure energy supply line ever. And they're completely dependent upon the U.S. Navy to protect their global shipping. And their war plan for Taiwan, I love this. Their war plan for Taiwan is so dumb. Like, we're going to sink all American ships within range and take the island, but the U.S. Navy everywhere else in the world is going to continue to protect our corporate shipping. That is literally their plan. That is like the second dumbest thing I've heard in the last 20 years. The dumbest thing also involves China. We can talk about the spy balloon if you want to later. And then you throw in the cult of personality, which means that the Chinese are now so ossified that information is not even flowing within their own government, and they can't make competent decisions anymore. You add it all up, and China has had a great moment But most of what has allowed China to become the China we know today is globalization. And the Americans aren't maintaining that anymore. And the other part of it is urbanization, which gives you growth, but you can only move people from the countryside to the city once. And if you can't keep that birth rate up, then they collapse. And that's exactly what we're facing this decade.
So does that mean that you see actually a military attack on Taiwan? Or are you actually belonging to those experts who do not see a military attack, a direct imminent military attack on Taiwan? Because right now I have the impression that the American expert community is quite split on the matter, and in the international one as well. We have a lot of hoax, but we also have a lot of, I would say, rather less experts who are cautious on that matter. And I myself don't see an imminent military attack on Taiwan. So I would like to hear your opinion on that.
I don't think anyone thinks it's imminent. The Chinese don't think they have sufficient command and control in order to manage an operation today. They're thinking that maybe they can do it in a few years. And you're right, the community is split at all levels. I tend to veer towards that it's never going to happen. Let me kind of lay that out. When you decide you're going to invade a country, there's certain things that you prepare for because you don't just pull the trigger. So the Chinese have always found the Russians to be useful idiots. So if they're going to do something that's a little sketchy, they try to get the Russians to do it first to see how it goes. And so when they look at Ukraine, they're you have to walk from Moscow to Kiev, and the Ukrainians have only been preparing for 8 years, and this war suddenly has gotten a lot more complicated than we thought. We've always known that Taiwan was going to be more difficult because it's going to be a naval assault. So assumption one, gone. Assumption two, Russian weapons are awesome. So they stole all the IP from the Russians and spent $3 trillion outfitting their troops. And now they're having some very serious buyer's remorse. The third assumption is that Russia and China are far too important to the global system, so no one will sanction them. Well, that's gone. But I think what's most terrified them is companies just walking away. I mean, there was something like $60 billion in foreign direct investment into the Russian system that was just abandoned because countries didn't want to be associated with a dictatorial, genocidal government at war. And so most of what they've planned for in terms of the environment has shifted. If you add in the fact that if there was a war, it would be very easy for the United States or Japan or Vietnam or India or Australia to just simply cut the trade artery, which would lead to a deindustrialization and a famine in under a year. The cost of doing this to them would be extreme. So from my point of view, it's almost not worth considering. The one bit of pause that I've got is because this is a cult of personality system. And when one person sets the tone for the propaganda and then just lets it run, crazy stuff happens. And in this case, the Chinese believe, because of their propaganda, that they're so important that no one will really lift a finger. There might be some minor sanctions for a few years, and that's it. On the battlefield, they believe that they could probably capture the island in 2 weeks because it takes 6 weeks for the U.S. to sail from San Diego to get there in the first place. So as long as they do it quick, they're fine. Let's assume that that's right. That doesn't help their problem with oil tankers transiting by India and Vietnam and the rest. So their belief is that the world won't do anything. And I would say that in the aftermath of Russia, that is a really, really stupid position to take. But in a cult of personality, taking stupid positions is how you show your loyalty. Another
major issue where we see that the expert community is quite split is this kind of topic of World War III versus Cold War 2.0. Now, you obviously made the case that, America was the reason for China's rise, and now will be also the main reason for China's demise in terms of geo-economic decline and in not just the demographic factors. So what is your take? Are we sliding into a Cold War 2.0 scenario in which we see that China and Russia are obviously interested in creating a credible counterweight to US global power projection? Or is it that there will be Pax Americana 2.0, that America will emerge out of this, episode with Russia's war against Ukraine and with the non-existent, real threat, but non-existent risk of military attack on Taiwan in the South China region? What is your main case? And of course, where do you see Europe being being positioned in all of this with the second, as I alert to a second case for a devastating, I would say, geopolitical and economic story in this decade.
I don't think we're looking at either of those scenarios. The Russians are utterly incapable of providing an alternative pole. And that's one of the reasons why no one has really sided with them in any meaningful way in the Ukraine war. Their economy just can't support it. Their infrastructure can't support it. Their technological system has apparently failed. And their demographics are terminal. So none of these things are likely to get much better. They may be able to eventually fully mobilize and bring more of their industry into the fight. I'm a little surprised that hasn't happened already, considering the stakes. But that is for Russia. That is for their near abroad. That is for trying to establish an outer crustal defense. That is not to become an independent pole. And then the Chinese, they're a massive exporter, which means that they need markets to dump all their product on. And so there is no sort of partnership with the Chinese that allows another country to do well. They just become a dumping ground or a source of raw materials. So people might want, the dream situation for a lot of countries is the Americans provide the security and the Chinese provide the economic access. But that wasn't ever going to work, even if politics in the United States supported it, which it does not. The Chinese moment is almost over because of demographic situations. So I don't think we'll see a hot war with these two powers. I don't think we'll even see a meaningful Cold War more than a few years with the Chinese. The Russians, the goal here of the West is to support Ukraine as much as possible, because as long as Ukraine is in the fight, but so long as Ukraine is independent, the Russians can't get that outer crustal defense, and they will be constantly on the strategic defensive until they disassociate. I don't think that's going to happen this decade. I think the Russians have a lot more road ahead of them than the Chinese, but it does put them in a bit of a box. And as for Europe and the rest, to get back to where we were during the Cold War economically, I don't think that's possible either. What made the global system work is the United States subsidized everybody's security systems and then provided global coverage navally so that anyone could ship anything to anywhere. We no longer have a Navy that is built for that. And one of the things we've seen in, say, the Persian Gulf of late is the Iranians have now grabbed, I believe, a half a dozen tankers. And aside from issuing a press release, the U.S. Navy has done nothing. Had that happened in the 70s or the 80s, we would have sunk quite a few Iranian naval assets and probably taken out a few offshore oil platforms to boot. But we no longer have the destroyer-heavy force that is necessary to patrol the seas for global commerce. We're heavy on supercarriers now.